Welcome to a conversation on international affairs. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Yegor Gaidar, the 1997 Hitchcock Lecturer at the University of California. Dr. Gaidar is an economist, and from November 1991 to January 94, he played a leading role in the transformation of the Soviet economy after the fall of communism, serving Prime Minister and then President Yeltsin as Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Economy and Finance. Dr. Gaidar, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you.
Tell us a little about your background. Your grandfather was the author of children's books, and your father was a military correspondent for Pravda.
Yeah, that's right. Both of my grandfathers were writers, and Arkady Gaidar was probably one of the most famous in our country. He also was a very well-known hero of the Civil War and of the Second World War. He really was a very good writer, but also a part of communist pantheon. He was pictured usually as a perfect communist hero, which was not really the truth. He was a talented man caught in a terrible tragedy of the revolution and civil war, started to fight when he was 14, regiment commander when he was 17, many times wounded, 22, demobilized from the army after the war as a regiment commander, very ill. Mm-hmm. So with this kind of biography, you could expect the person to be a misanthrope. He started to write a very, very nice, very interesting children's books.
And how does having a grandfather like that influence a young person? He was killed in the war, so he was dead before you were born.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Well, there was two visions of this. First of all, he really was part of this ideology and of this pressure on the children, etc. somehow. So when I come to school, everybody all the time tried to speak with me about my father. But I think that the first words that my first teacher was telling me, well, how could you write so badly when your grandfather was so great a writer? So I was so sick of it, so I tried to study good so that nobody will touch me with my grandfather. But all the same, I really loved his books. They really are. Even now I read them a year ago, and they're really good, they're interesting, it's good Russian literature. So it was as if how it was two Arkady Gaidars, one part of the communist pantheon, and another very talented, not very happy person whom I were able to know from the tales of my father, grandmother, etc.
So that was a real challenge. Moving between these two exactly. Images. And your father was a military correspondent for Pravda.
Yes, exactly.
But he wanted you to be an economist.
Yes. He was in the Navy before, and I wanted very much also to follow his steps and also to go to the Navy. I was very much interested in it, etc. But then he very delicately pushed me in the direction of economics. Somehow he had a feeling that the economy would play a very important role in the history of our country during next
And he proved to be right. Well, tell me a little about your economic training. You got your PhD in Russia.
Moscow State University. Yes.
Right. And which theorists most influenced you that we in the West would be familiar with?
Well, first of all, of course, the economic training during the Soviet era time was first of all based on the Orthodox Marxism. So, of course, you were taught something about the bourgeois economic theories, etc. But if you would prefer not to know them, you can use textbooks and never go in depth, etc. So that still creates some problems. But if you were willing to study, of course there were libraries. If you know English, you could find the books. You have to explain why do you have to read all of these bourgeois theories, etc. But you can explain it. So a lot dependent on whether you are willing. I think that probably Adam Smith, he would probably love, but Adam Smith had a major influence on.
And what in particular? His concept of the market?
Yes, his concept of the market, of the world, of the market world, his liberal picture of the world, of course.
Yes. Now, you also, as part of your education, I guess when you were younger, studied both in Yugoslavia and Cuba.
Well, I was schoolboy, yes.
Yes. And what did you get from that experience? Did it make you a better communist? Or?
Well, I was in Cuba when I was very young.
I see.
And that was exactly exactly after the Cuban Revolution, during the Carib crisis, etc.
So you were there during the missile crisis, a young kid?
Yeah,
I see.
It was terribly interesting, terribly romantic, because it's a young revolution, nice, still working American theorist civilization, still everything functions, but also the girls with the machine guns, which is stepping it in a corner and starting to make our room, etc. Well, very romantic for a 7-year-old boy. But also it was the first time when I started in the beginning to ask some economic questions. For instance, the fruits in Havana are on the targets, on the talons, limited.
Yeah.
If you are going 100 kilometers from Havana, the mountains of oranges living there without use.
So a supply and demand problem.
But somehow it is impossible to get it from here to Havana because it's speculation. So it's very difficult for anybody to explain to me why it is so.
And did you ask? I mean, yes. That's interesting. Your generation was really a fortunate one, in the sense that you could still benefit in your education as the system was coming down, and in a way prepare for the future, even if it was on the side, even if the system didn't formally allow you to do that.
Well, yes, our generation really was fortunate, because we were already old enough to have a possibility to use the opportunities, and young enough to be able to adopt to the new realities, to adopt to the changing, rapidly changing world, yes.
So you are an economist. The wall comes down in Eastern Europe. Communism is in essence loses power, although it's still there. How did you get thrust into government service?
Well, it was the moment of a very, very difficult political and economic situation. I was then a young head of probably the best Russian research economic institution, which was called Institute of Economic Policy of the Russian Academy of Science. We were able to create the team of young market-oriented economists in Moscow from the different institutions and in St. Petersburg. After August coup, it was evident that the old system doesn't function anymore.
And this would be the coup that against Gorbachev as head, yes, right.
August coup 91.
Right.
It was evident that the economy is in shambles. It was very difficult to understand why it's doable in this type of the situation. So the line of those willing to take the responsibility was very, very short. It was the time when Yeltsin was having negotiations with the different personalities to whom he proposed to head the government, and everybody refused to do it. And I do understand very well the grounds on which they refused. From the beginning, he asked me and my colleagues to act as his advisors. So it is much more natural role for the academic than to be the actual government leader. And we were absolutely prepared to exactly this role. But then it was evident that, well, it's very nice to give an advice, and who will do all of it? So that's when we started to discuss the possibilities that probably we will have to not only to advise but also to do it and to take responsibility for what we are doing.
You say no one was in the line to take this job. Why was that? Because they had no ideas about what to do, or they were afraid to do it, or they still believed in the old system?
No, first of all, because they were afraid to do it or had no ideas what should be done. It was evident that the time of a nice solutions, pleasant solutions, solutions for which you will be prized, is back in the past. Now you have to deal with a very, very unpleasant, difficult solution. You have, for instance, well, just a few things that we have to do. Cut down military expenditure 5 times. Okay. Do you think it's easy? Cut down the subsidies to the agriculture a few times. It's conflicting. Introduce the high value-added tax. It's conflicting. Liberalize the prices, which inevitably lead to the realization that a lot of the savings of the population were artificial savings and it's nothing behind them. It's difficult. You have to deal with a country which have the grain reserves, which would last you until February, without hard currency, without gold, and the country which is unable to pay for previously accumulated debt. How you will manage it? So that was exactly the time when it was evident that even if you will be able to find some solutions to these problems, they would not be the popular solutions. We have seen the experience of our friends in Eastern Europe, which had the incomparably easier tasks, and some of them have done it splendidly, but I don't remember that any of them was prized very much for doing it. And it was evident for us and for anybody else that even if you will be successful, it will not be the fact that anybody will tell, how nice have they done, let us prize them, etc. It will not be like this.
You're in the situation of the parent giving the child castor oil, basically, for its health.
Yes. But having to do much more dangerous operation.
Yeah, right.
And with a child which is able to kill his parents.
That's right.
He'll be dissatisfied.
So what impelled you to say, I'll do it? Was it your belief in the ideas that you were going to implement, or was it a kind of a natural self-confidence that you had acquired from your childhood?
Well, of course it was the belief in the ideas.
Yeah.
I was absolutely sure, I was not absolutely sure that we'll succeed, but I was absolutely sure that first of all there is no other way, and was absolutely sure that the delays is suicide for the country. And if you do believe in it, then you have to try. You have to do it. It's not a personal matter. It's a matter of the country.
The plan, what you were trying to do was move the Soviet and then the Russian economy, the Soviet Union had now broken apart, to a market economy. How can we explain to people what that means? In other words, could you draw a picture of, in essence, for the average person, what it might mean, what that old way of life meant, and what a change involves? For example, for a younger person of your generation, what were the possibilities that he would have in this future that you were envisioning that he didn't have in the old system?
Well, first of all, you have to understand that socialist system was a very, very specific set of the comprehensive institutions. So it's not as if you are taking some details from this and combining it with market, etc. It's very, very comprehensive. And it is very difficult for the person who had no chance to live under this system to understand how it works, how it is structured, and also how dangerous it is when it's starting to fall apart. Well, for instance, you are coming to the retail store And you're absolutely sure that you will get the bread in this retail store, that you will get the milk in this retail store, and that you will get the meat if you need it in the retail store. You are going to the gasoline station and you know that you will have the gasoline there. You know that there will be light in your room, etc. And it is not, as Adam Smith mentioned once, it's not because you depend on the charity or goodwill of the baker, or etc., etc.
Right.
It's the normal work of the mechanism of market. So let us imagine for a minute that nothing of this works. That if the state would not give precise orders, which will go to the grain producers, what to produce, where to send the grain, what to do with the grain, where to produce milk, where to send the milk, where to produce the components necessary for the milk production, etc., etc. Nothing will be done because there is no interest in it. Money doesn't work, markets doesn't work. Only if this very comprehensive system, which is based not on the interest but on the power, which goes through all of the enormous country from Moscow to Kamchatka, which depends on the possibility of the highest level of the government to influence directly by order that would be implemented, the developments in Kaliningrad, Kamchatka, Sakhalin, etc., only then the system could work. So, well, imagine for a minute that you withdraw power from this system. Power isn't efficient anymore. Well, the coup failed, Communist Party doesn't exist, KGB doesn't exist, there is no fear. What will happen? You will not be confronted with some economic problems. You will be confronted with a complete economic chaos, because there will be no bread in the shops because there is no interest, and no bread in the shops because there are no efficient orders. There will be no electricity because there is no interest, and no electricity because no orders to produce coal, to supply to the... So you are having the full-scale catastrophe of the very, very delicate mechanism of the modern industrial society. That was really the starting point. So it was not like, for instance, we do have a working socialist economy, it functions, it's nice, we are elaborating the program of reform, we are thinking how to make it better, we are implementing them, etc. No. When the communism collapsed, it was the start of the collapse of all of the mechanisms of the microeconomic regulation. Soldiers are not getting bread because nobody supplied them. Big cities are without food. Population is preparing to save himself somehow. It was very well pictured in the Russian novels exactly at the moment. So this expectation of the catastrophe. So when we had to start, we had to elaborate the plan. First of all, not of how to build the splendid, nice, perfect, stable market economy, etc., but to urgently, somehow, without preparations, without the necessary preconditions, make markets work. It was evident that it would be impossible to make the state farms to supply grain without for the orders. So somehow, in a very short period of time, we had to reintroduce the efficient money in the economy and to make market mechanism work. That was the essence of the plan we were elaborating. It was evident for us that there is no 100% efficient solution, that no strategy will guarantee the success, but at least what was evident what you have to do to try to do it. Like, for instance, well, what I was thinking at the moment as a possible model for it. You're flying in the plane. Then you see that the crew of the plane...
Bye-bye.
Parachute. And then either it will crash or somebody will go to the place, at least try to do something. That was exactly my view of the situation in 91.
And so what became the key to coming up with a response? In other words, the theory that told you how markets work gave you a general guideline to how you should respond to particular sets of crises. What else was at work here?
Well, first of all, during a few years before, we were all the time doing the concrete research in the workings of the Russian economy. We had more or less precise picture of where are the weak points, where are the most dangerous problems, etc. We had the pictures of how the crisis will evolve. We had the understanding of our weakest point. We had the understanding of in what direction we should try to move as rapidly as we can.
So what was the plan? Give me some indicators of what you tried to do.
What was the plan? First of all, what was necessary to do? It was the crucial short-term problem was food supply to the cities. If you cannot do it by orders, then the only way you can do it by creating efficient money. So the crucial it was to create efficient money which will allow us to recreate the food market. To create efficient money, we had to deal with a few separate problems. First problem, the problem of ruble zone. We still were living in the country in which 16 independent banks were creating money. Union Bank and 15 Republican banks. And all had a very serious stimulus to compete, because in this situation those who were printing money faster than others are getting additional benefits. So, like for instance, let us imagine the situation here. There is no anymore United States. There are 51 states, independent states, from tomorrow. You're living in California. You somehow have to regain the possibility of financial control. All of the states are competing in printing money. You cannot just close your borders because, well, you do not have the instruments. How you will make the transactions? How you define which money is money is much is not? You have the cash money, which is so how? The first and the crucial precondition was, as rapidly as you can, divide the ruble zone and create the independent and Russian central bank, which will regain the control over the money creation in the ruble zone. But you need some time to do it. At least 6 to 8 months. It's impossible to do it early. So the crucial point is that somehow you have to live through these 6 to 8 months. You do not have the food reserves which would last you till this period. So to wait with the price liberalization so long, it's impossible. To liberalize prices with the presence of this possibility of money creation is enormous risk of hyperinflation. So let us liberalize the prices immediately, let us face this risk, but let us add it with a very, very serious tightening of the budgetary monetary policy in Russia. Russia still is 60% of the Soviet Union economy. So if Russia is radically tightening policy, it radically cuts military expenditure, radically cuts subsidies, introduce high value-added taxes, etc., it means that this enormous flow of money will be confronted with at least some obstacles. So there's chances that we'll be confronted with the high inflation, but not with the hyperinflation catastrophe, which will make all of your monetary mechanism impossible. Well, you do not have customs, practically you do not have customs, because all Soviet customs do not exist anymore, and the Russian customs still do not exist. You have a terrible problems for the food supply. So let us, for a temporary period, for half of the year, introduce the zero import tariffs, so that imports could play substantial role in making the market mechanism work. Well, you have to deal with the 100% nationalized retail trade and generally the economy. This retail trade is, during the decades, was recreating the shortage because, well, the salesman in Soviet shop, it was not just a salesman, he was a big boss. He was deciding, well, maybe he will give you something or he will refuse it. To have a friend, a salesman, it was a great social success. So it was evident that the retail trade will try to do everything it can to recreate the shortage phenomena. So that's why we immediately issued a decree which allowed the trade to everybody, every place, without any restrictions. it was evident that we have to start the structural reforms like privatization. It also was evident that only the fools could think that you can privatize the economy in a 2-month period of time. So try to start these reforms as rapidly as you can, but not wait until the results of these reforms would be evident. Monopolies and anti-monopoly policy. Well, it is evident that you cannot change the structure of the economy, which was formed through the decades, during a few weeks before the price liberalization. So the most efficient thing you can do to fight with the monopolies is opening the economy as rapidly as you can, because it's the best way to. So that were approximately few of the lines we were trying to implement.
So in a way, the challenge is systemic.
Yes.
In other words, you essentially having to act across the board in the whole economy. Now, as an economist, a person who has been trained in theory, how do you change when you take on a role like this? You obviously are still informed by the theory, but you're really making up things in part as you go along, right?
Yes. What is important in this type of the situation? Well, usually the deep economic training is not necessary for the decision makers. That is not their job. Usually they have the economic advisors or deputy ministers of finance who are trained economically, etc. But it is not the job of prime minister to know the economic details,
right,
because usually the changes are slow, not very radical. Everything is very national, and it's just unnecessary. In this situation of very rapid changes, when the common sense do not give you an answers, because the advices of the common sense could be terribly harmful, as we have seen during this transition. Of course, you need to have the clear picture of what was, what should be done, where are the problems, where are most dangerous points, etc. But also when you're starting to do, you are confronted with the day-to-day urgent political problems in different fields. You cannot just concentrate on making the reforms. You have to deal with the national problems, with the relationship with the autonomous republics, problems with the CIS, Russian minorities in Baltic states, conflict between Ingushetia and North Ossetia, war in Moldova, etc. Inevitably, you have to deal with all of these problems.
What sort of a political leader do you need in a situation like this? And did Yeltsin meet that test?
Well, generally, yes. First of all, you need a political leader who has a general feeling of what should be done. Not in the details, not in the technical details, but the direction. Second, you need the leader who has a feeling of the popular mood. Because it is not a technocratic solution. Well, we as a technocrat could advise, we know what to do, but it is very difficult for us to have a feeling what could be done, what just could not be done.
So you might say to cut the subsidies on bread, but Yeltsin has to have a feeling
whether
what the shop...
Whether it is possible or it is impossible. If it is possible, he has a possibility to tell to the people that it is necessary to do, which I, of course, never had as he. And then, of course, you need to be decided person. The person who... Decisive person. The person who could make a decision and stick to the decision. And generally, Yeltsin, I think, had all of these features.
So what lesson do you draw from this experience for your colleagues as economists about what it's like to be, I guess, in the frying pan is what you were in, or in the cockpit of the plane after the previous crew has just left, to follow up on your metaphor?
Well, generally, my advice would be not make too complicated schemes. I do remember a long discussions, participate in these discussions about sequencing of the measures in the reform process. Major part of it was nonsense. The life, you cannot influence the life in a so detailed way. You have usually a very crude weapons, very imprecise. Don't try fine-tuning, especially in a situation like this.
As you look back at what you did and these enormous constraints that you were under, the obstacles you face, what sort of a grade do you give yourself? What would you have done differently in this period where you had such
probably a lot. Technically, I would make the system of the international trade and hard currency regulation from the 1st January 92 simpler that it was done. I would distribute the licenses a little bit another way. So there was a lot of the technical details I probably would do another way if I would have these possibilities. But in a general directions, taking in mind the political possibilities, not if I was the God Almighty, but in this concrete situation, I think that generally I would do exactly what I have done.
Now, in the course of doing all of these things, you're in essence creating your own opposition in the short term, right?
Of course.
But also in the back of your mind must be the idea that you're creating new classes of people who would be supporters of the system now and in the future.
Not only in the back.
Yeah, there, right there.
Yes, of course, that was one of our crucial ideas. All the time we were trying to create the social basis for the reforms which will make them sustainable.
And so that means that, let's help the audience understand that, that means that the system has now come apart, where orders came from the top and there was this here and that there. Now you're trying to create a class of people who are entrepreneurs, basically, who would supply the food because they see that they will make a profit and they know there's a market for it.
And that is really, if you compare Russia 91 and Russia 96, that is enormous difference, because we had created this class. It's not only the country of the very rich and the very poor. It's a very, very simplified picture. What is important is that it is a country with increasing middle class, with increasing part of the population with standards of the middle class. For instance, when you are traveling somewhere, for instance, into some middle-sized Russian city, for instance, Magnitogorsk, and on Friday you see a long, long line of the not very expensive automobiles bringing Russian families to their dachas 10 kilometers from Magnitogorsk. You see exactly this emerging Russian middle class. And with all of these problems, it's evident that this middle class is being developed, that it is connected with the market economy, and exactly the position of this middle class, from my point of view, played a crucial role in the Yeltsin's victory on the 96 presidential elections.
In your short monograph describing your plan and its implementation, you describe almost with wonder the way constituents would change. There's some reference, I think, to military suppliers who, over the time of your involvement in policy, changed their view of the world and began to think, well, how will we sell our product? That must have been quite satisfying,
yes,
actually.
Yeah. Well, it was satisfying. Yes, also I have seen the different examples. I have seen a lot of the representatives of the previous elites, business elites, absolutely unable to adapt to the new realities. And that is a sad story for themselves, for the enterprises, etc. But also I have seen the success stories.
As I hear the complexity of these tasks that you undertook, I am amazed by your capacity to undertake all this. And I want to understand exactly, again, and we talked a little about this, what motivates you? I mean, what allows you to continue in this turmoil, in this chaos, and undertake these different directions when, in fact, you don't know if it's really going to work. I mean, your theory suggests that it will, and so on. But how? What does it take? Enormous self-confidence? Does it? What are the elements there of undertaking such an enormous enterprise?
Well, somebody has to do it. If it would be, maybe it would be another person, and maybe he would be sitting on my place, but somebody would have to do it and answer these questions.
Now, one of the in some of your press conferences, and I think just a few moments ago, you were suggesting that in a way you realize that you might be a sacrificial lamb in a sense, that in saying, as you just said, that somebody has to do it. But is there something here in the sense that since you were not a professional politician, you were willing to try because you knew after having done it, you could leave the scene, basically?
Well,
is that at work here?
Well, partly yes. First of all, the problem was that nobody was sure that we will be able to leave the scene. When the situation was discussed in the 91.
So you would be able to, I'm sorry?
Nobody was sure that we will be able just peacefully to leave the scene.
Yeah.
That we will not be shot, for instance, etc.
Right.
But the point that I never had the political ambitions and never wanted the political roles, and my only dream is to be calmly back to my academic work. Of course it helped, because I had not to think all the time about how it will influence my long-term political perspective, whether it will help me or impede me in being elected president in the year 2008, etc.
Right. Right. And this team that you put together, basically, it sounds like there was a kind of a ferment, an excitement. It sounds almost like the New Deal here in a much more difficult situation. Yes. Is that fair? Right.
Yes.
So it's like you were running an academic seminar in a way, but actually applying your discussions quite immediately.
Yes, yes. Well, we started as an academic seminar, and somehow we had to implement our ideas in the practice.
Now, but you now, leaving the burdens of office is not a problem for you. I mean, it must be very difficult for somebody with an academic temperament to be thrown in this vortex.
Yes, it is.
What are the sort of pressures on you, other than you never sleep, it sounds like?
First of all, it is the problem of the different timing. Mm-hmm. Well, when you are an academic, you are thinking you're planning your life in the weeks, months, and the years. When you are starting to be the advisor, for instance, members of the Council of the Economic Advisors, you are planning your time in days and hours. When you are a decision maker in a situation of extreme crisis, you have to plan your time in minutes. And in many occasions, you have 15 minutes to listen to the arguments and then to make the solutions, of which terribly a lot depends in your country. And that's very, well, the comfort of thinking 30 minutes calmly, it's enormous comfort for the decision maker in a crisis. And for the academician, not being able to think 30 minutes calmly, it's a very serious pain.
What would you advise young people in terms of studying in the academy and preparing for this world?
I hope they never will be in my situation with myself and my colleagues. Just do understand one thing. Revolutions sounds terribly romantic. It's nice to read about them, very interesting to study. My advice, never experience one yourselves, because it's terribly difficult for your country.
Why was there not more violence? Why did the breakdown caused by the pain that was being inflicted, all of the dire predictions, they didn't come true? Why was that?
Well, I think that mostly because the difference between the Russian Revolution of the 1917 and 1991, 1993 was that still we were dealing with industrialized society, literate society, well-educated society which survived a very difficult experience during the 20th century, society which were prepared to understand how dangerous it is to put all of your stakes on the force. And we practically had a short-term civil war in Russia on the 3rd and the 4th of October 1993. But the fact that we were able to prevent large-scale civil war, I think is first of all connected with the fact that during this century, Russian society became much more mature. Now do understand how terribly dangerous it is to start the full-scale civil war.
What is next on the agenda for the Soviet economy? If things stabilize somewhat, what is the next major set of reforms that have to be undertaken?
Well, a few are very important. I will just mention them. A reform of the system of social protection, which is terribly inefficient at the present stage. The reform of the system of the interrelationship between federal budget and the regional budget, which is terribly inefficient. Tax reform, because tax structure is very much distorted. Land reform and agriculture reform, private property should be implemented in this field. Further reforms connected with the regulation of the natural monopolies, which are poorly regulated still, etc., etc., etc. So, of course, we have a lot to do to make this economy more efficient, more stable, more socially just, etc.
But the situation is, we're over the hump, or the Russia is over the hump now, basically, in the sense that addressing these problems are much more manageable than they were in this period.
We were passing through the period of revolution. The period of revolution is the period when your possibility to plan anything and implement it's very much constrained. All the time you are having the weak government in the revolutions, and you have to deal with the very, very strong problems and the pressures. Now I think that we passed this period. Now I think that the whole history of the communism in Russia is really over. Now we are confronted with a lot of problems, not unsimilar to many problems with which other market economies are being confronted. And it is the time for a serious, maybe difficult, technically complicated, but manageable reforms.
One problem that we haven't addressed is that in all of this, Russia has, in essence, lost its empire, basically. Now, one thinks of the Weimar period in Germany and the dislocation, the disillusionment that is caused when a great power becomes less of a great power. Does that remain a problem for Russia? And what are the possibilities of a kind of a right-wing nationalist response that would be dangerous for the world?
Well, if I am not mistaken, I think that I was the first to mention the parallel between the situation in post-Soviet Russia and the Weimar Germany. It was, I think, somewhere around 92. And, of course, I still do think that it is a very, very dangerous parallel. Because it's very easy. The easiest policy making is to play on the hard national feelings. It was all the Jewish American plot. We were never beaten in the battle. We were betrayed from the back. Now we have to recover it. We have once again to be an empire. We will reconquer it, etc. So all of this rhetorics is very, very familiar from the Germany 30s. And for instance, when you will read a lot of the writings, including the writings of the influential Russian politicians of the opposition, you will see the evident analogies with Hitler's writings, etc. So, of course, the danger is there. And from my point of view, it is probably most serious danger for my country and maybe for the world.
What is the way of dealing with it? By tackling these problems and solving them and coming up with some... I
think that, well, of course, the fascism, National Socialism in Germany, first of all, triumphed because of these pains, but also because of the Great Depression. So the earlier we will start Russian economy moving, the earlier we will be in a position to create the preconditions for sustainable economic growth, the earlier we will be in a position to implement the reform I mentioned, which will make this market economy more efficient and more socially stable, the less expressed would be chances of the radical nationalists to use all of these problems to grab the power in Moscow.
And what is the role of the West in all of this, the European community in the United States? How can they be a help without being seen as an intruder or someone who's trying to overly impact on what should be Russian solutions?
Well, I never overestimate the possibilities generally of the West to influence the situation in Russia, and they are limited. But of course the West could do something. For instance, any serious step connected with the opening of the markets, especially opening of the markets to the Russian manufacturing industries, is enormous help. Because it shows that you can be part of the world economy. It creates a stimulus for those who are able to adapt, etc. So any step in this direction is very important. Try not to ignore the Russian national interests, which do exist, and try to take them in mind when you are planning your international policy. Try not to make your international policy dependent on purely domestic issues. It would be important, because other way around, everybody will have to pay for it. Try not to look at the world from the position of winners and the losers, because everybody is the winner because the Russian communism disappears. So the problem is how we structure our future in the 21st century.
Dr. Gaidar, what thought would you like to leave us with regard to what you tried to achieve and what you achieved in transforming the Russian economy?
Well, we were confronted not with a splendid, stable situation, which was in need of a small improvement. We were called to the government after the complete collapse of the previous regime. And that is the fact that is ignored by many of those who are trying to write about what happened in Russia during a few years. It was the moment in which our possibility to implement the comprehensive reforms were very limited, because we had all the time to deal with the crisis situation. Now I think that with all of the problems which still do exist in Russia, the major problems of the stabilization of the markets and the democracy probably are resolved. Now a lot depends on the ability of Russia to adjust to the new realities, to move further, to create the basis for sustainable economic growth, and a lot depends from the ability of the world, first of all leading nations, to accept Russia as an equal in the family of the industrial democracies.
Dr. Gaidar, thank you very much for coming in here today and explaining, describing, and helping us understand this very exciting period when you change the course of the Russian economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation on international affairs.